Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to another Q-Line program. We're going to be here with you all the way up until 2:25 this afternoon with what I hope will be a very interesting and enlightening and informative program. This being the last Friday of the month, we'll have with us as our regular guest Dr. Bob Morey. We'll tell you more about Dr. Morey in a moment. And also Sheila Thompson, who is the assistant to the president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's an atheist organization in Madison, Wisconsin. And she is going to be speaking in Chicago on the 27th before the American Rationalist Convention. She's going to be talking about the problem with Jesus, dealing with the non-historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. She does not believe that he ever existed. So we're going to be discussing that subject and a few others with Sheila Thompson and Dr. Bob Morey in just a few moments. I hope it'll be all that I expect it to be. Both of our guests are very outgoing and have good senses of humor, so I suppose we should have a good program with them today. We'll be getting them on the telephone, and we'll be beginning our discussion in just a couple of moments. 7 minutes now past 1 o'clock, and time for me to introduce to you our guests for this afternoon. First of all, Sheila Thompson, who is up in Madison, Wisconsin. She's assistant to the president being Ann Gaylor of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an organization in Madison, Wisconsin, an organization which quite unashamedly calls itself an atheist organization. Sheila, welcome to the program this afternoon.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
And on the phone with us from out in Pennsylvania is one of our favorite people who is here the last Friday of each month. And he is Dr. Robert Morey. He's professor of Christian Apologetics at Perry Bible Institute in New Bloomfield, Pennsylvania, and pastor of the New Life Bible Church in Duncannon, Pennsylvania. He's received degrees from Covenant College and Westminster Theological Seminary. He's an authority in the fields of Christian philosophy, apologetics, the cults, and the occult. He is an author of a number of books, including Reincarnation in Christianity, A Christian's Handbook for Defending the Faith, The Bible and Drug Abuse, and Horoscopes and the Christian. And he has a couple of new books coming out in the very near future. Dr. Morey, welcome to the program this afternoon.
Thank you very much. What's the weather like out there today?
Hot and sunny. Sunny and hot. But I don't suppose we can expect anything except that sort of thing for the next few weeks. I was explaining to our listeners that both of you have good senses of humor, or both of you have a good sense of humor. Maybe that's
for Dr. Morey, I accept his apology. He's a professor of apologetics. I accept his apology for Christianity.
Well, we'll get to that. But as you can see, she's got a good sense of humor, and Dr. Morey has a good sense of humor, so while the two will definitely disagree this afternoon, I suspect there will be no bloodshed or anything like that, especially since they're at such great distance. But let's get right to the subject that is at hand first of all, then we can get to some other things. But Sheila is going to be speaking in Chicago on the 27th before the American Rationalist Convention. And her speech is titled The Problem with Jesus, and it deals with the non-historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. She believes that Jesus never existed. Sheila, could you give us a little bit of information on that subject, what you're going to be talking about tomorrow, and where you ever got the idea that Jesus of Nazareth never existed?
Okay, this is a subject that I've been absolutely fascinated with for the last 8 months. The Freedom from Religion Foundation went on television with a program, Jesus, Man, Myth, or Fraud, and it was at that time I decided I better learn something about the historicity of Jesus. When I started digging into it, I found out that the overwhelming number of Protestant biblical scholars today do not believe that Jesus of Nazareth, a Jesus, in other words, who said and did all of the things that the Gospels say he said and did, probably, in their view, never existed. And that if there was any kind of a Jesus upon whom Christianity was founded, that type of Jesus we really know nothing about. And this is what I've been consuming myself with the last 8 months, is studying the historicity of Jesus. And I am absolutely positive myself that there wasn't a Jesus of Nazareth any more than there was a Paul Bunyan.
Dr. Morey, what about this statement that the overwhelming number of Protestant leaders or churchmen or whatever don't really believe in the existence of the Jesus of the New Testament?
Well, I think she gave the answer when she mentioned that she's been looking at it out of curiosity for about 8 months. I myself have looked at the primary sources for over 20 years. The historicity of Jesus is founded upon more historical evidence than what is needed for any other historical character. So that if anyone looks at the primary documentation from Roman sources, Jewish sources such as the Talmud, the Mishnah, we can list these later on, you can get 10, 20, 30, 40 literary references to Jesus of Nazareth in the first century, many of them before AD 70, and even the enemies of Christ, such as the Jewish writers who wrote against Jesus in the Talmud, or the heathen or pagan writers, they would be the counterpart of Sheila in the early part of the church. All of them, without hesitation, admitted that Jesus lived and admitted that he taught what he did. Sheila's basic error has been pointed out by John Montgomery in his book, Christianity and History. What he points out is that there are modern anti-Christian thinkers, particularly in Germany, who, because they are rationalists, have simply said, reality will correspond to what I think it is. Don't confuse me with the archaeological facts. My mind is already made up. And these people, instead of having reality force them to accept what is there, the New York Times pointed out that when a portion of the Gospel of Luke was found, which must be dated AD 57, and possibly a piece of Mark, which must be dated AD 50, now we're talking within 20 years, and the Gospel of Luke probably written within 5 or 6 years, the Gospel of Mark, that is, of the death of Christ. These same modern theologians said, we cannot accept the archaeological finds because it would destroy our theories. And even the New York Times couldn't resist simply saying these are examples of people who simply do not want the primary sources and the facts to destroy their theories.
All right, Sheila, Dr. Morey's made a couple of points. First of all, he refers to this primary documentation. He says there is more evidence than is necessary to establish the identity or the existence of any historical figure. What kind of information have you found? What is the basis of your conclusion?
It's absolutely incorrect. There is no real evidence that Jesus of Nazareth existed, and there's all kinds of evidence that he did not. Basically...
All right, let's get some of the evidence that he did not.
I'm going to come down to it. Okay. The books that I have read were written by men who have spent their lifetime studying this. This isn't just me and my little 8 months. These are the writings of people who've spent their entire life on it. And he will find out that if you look at Paul, the writings of Paul, and Paul is the only historical writer of the New Testament, and Paul did not give an historical account of Jesus of Nazareth in Acts. Absolutely no way. Paul's Jesus is a completely different Jesus than you find in the Gospels. There's no comparison whatsoever. Paul's Jesus does not do any miracles. The Gospel Jesus is absolutely full of miracles all over the place. Paul's Jesus, he doesn't give any huge teachings on ethics. Paul's Jesus was not killed by the Jews. The Gospel writers just absolutely love to blame the killing of Jesus on the Jews. Paul, in his writings, does not mention who Jesus' parents were. He does not say where this Jesus supposedly was killed. He tells us absolutely nothing about this guy that he supposedly was a great admirer or a great follower of. We know nothing about a Jesus from Paul's writings, absolutely nothing.
All right, let's take this matter of Paul. What did, in your opinion, what was the purpose of Paul's writings? What did he...
I'll tell you what it was is, Paul was hung up on this risen Christ, and G.A. Wells seems to think that where it all came from was the Jewish wisdom literature, an idea that a Messiah was going to would come probably a son of a David, because David was the Jews' most successful king, and when a flesh and blood one didn't come, then this king had to come from heaven, that this Messiah would come. And it comes right out of the Jewish wisdom literature, and the Jesus of the Jewish wisdom literature is not the Jesus of the Gospels. He's totally a different person. Also, Paul never calls Jesus Jesus of Nazareth or the Son of Man. By the way, there is no evidence whatsoever that there was a city or a place called Nazareth in the first century. You do not find a city or a place called Nazareth in the Old Testament, in the Talmud, or in Josephus' writings. And if you want to get into the Gospels flatly are not historical documents.
All right, let's take one piece at a time here because it's very difficult. Let's try to keep both the responses short so that the other person has a chance to remember what was said and to respond. Dr. Morey, Sheila says that Paul is the only historical writer in the New Testament. Is that your understanding? And also that his Jesus was an entirely different Jesus than the Jesus of the other gospel writers?
Well, it would come as shock to the Apostle Paul. He quotes from the Gospel of Luke in such places as in 1 Timothy 5. He was familiar with the Gospels. They were written before he wrote his epistles. There was no reason for him to give a biography when there were 4 of them already in circulation. As I have stated, the evidence for the historicity of Jesus relies first on the New Testament, and we have portions of this found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated AD 50, 57, 66, etc. You also have the Jewish sources in the first century Talmud, which says Jesus was the bastard son of Mary and a Roman soldier, and gives his name. The Mishnah, which says all followers of this Jesus will suffer eternal punishment. The Jewish apocalyptic literature, which attacked Jesus. Roman historians, Josephus.
All right, now what about Josephus? We have a difference of opinion. Sheila is...
Yeah, difference of opinion with absolutely everything that this guy is saying. I can't believe him. Paul was the first is the only historical writer, and Paul wrote before the Gospels were even written. Paul is the closest one to this supposedly Jesus character. The other writings were after that. That's why Paul's Jesus is different than the Gospel Jesus, because he didn't have the Gospel.
All right, now, Dr. Morey, Sheila suggests that Paul's writings came before the writings of all of the other people who wrote the books of the New Testament.
That's correct, they did. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't even mention a Jesus. The Dead Sea Scrolls have to do with a teacher of righteousness. And it's possible that this Jesus idea, there's a lot of ideas, but it's one of the possibilities, slight one, is that this Jesus was built around the teacher of righteousness of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Josephus, every honest theologian today knows that long passage in Josephus is an interpolation. It's been known to be an interpolation since 1838 when Nathaniel Lardner first debated it in a book called Jewish Testimonies, Volume 6, the work published in London. I don't even need this guy to tell me that.
All right, Dr. Morey, what about the Josephus and what about the...
Josephus was...
All right, we've got that point, but let's get to Dr. Morey's answer to your question about Josephus and also the matter of the order of the Gospels. Did Paul write his gospel when, and so on? Dr. Morey.
Yes. If you would have been keeping up with reports in Newsweek, Time Magazine, New York Times, London Times, Biblical Archaeological Review, you would have read that there has come a drastic shift. Dr. James Robinson of Oxford has thoroughly now discredited the idea of dating the Gospels after AD 70 on the fact that in the Dead Sea Scrolls there were found portions of the New Testament. For example, the Gospel of Mark, a part of that has to be dated around AD 50. Luke, AD 57. The part of the Gospel of Acts from AD 66. These things are sitting there. This has been reported. This immediately discredits all the 19th century theologians which Sheila's depending upon. And besides Josephus, which I believe is a valid reading, and there are good scholars for that,
very few, darn few.
You also have Tacitus, Orosius, Suetonius, Lucian, Lampridas, Celsus, Porphyry, Julian the Apostate. You have dozens.
All I can say is you really need to apologize.
Jesus and the Christians who follow them. Now, since you have never dealt with the primary resources, have you read Tacitus? Yes or no?
Tacitus wrote his Annals around 120 AD. There is nothing written by the Christians, the Jews, or the pagans before the end of the first century, by the time the second century rolled around, at that time, the Jewish writers were already believing that this legend that the Christians had told them. Besides, I've read what it says in Tacitus.
Have you read
it?
All right, now let's give Dr. Morey a chance to answer. He's got a question for you. Dr. Morey?
Orosius in AD 49 mentions that the Jews were expelled from Rome under Claudius because riots had broken out as they were fighting over the issue of whether or not Jesus was the Christ. You also have in AD 74 a pagan philosopher writing a letter. Mara is his name. This has been translated. It's not anything I have dug up myself. It's in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, where he compares Jesus of Nazareth to such people as Socrates. You have the Nazareth stone, AD 50. It is an archaeological find. Sheila, your resources, because you don't deal with the primary resources, you're dealing with thinkers who are either 19th century thinkers or who today rely upon that. For example, the foolishness of saying Paul versus Jesus business has been refuted by Dr. Gresham Machen at Princeton University and has been thoroughly discredited. And it's only those who harken back to the old 19th century German rationalists pay any attention to that trash whatsoever.
All right, we're going to have to take a break right now. We didn't get any commercials in during the first segment. We've got to get in a few here now. We'll be back in just a moment. Sheila, you made a point, and I wanted to get a clarification from you on that. Do you believe that because each of the 40-some writers of the books of the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible, don't rehash what each other said, that means that some are more reliable than others?
Well, no, it's just that you have to look at it from a point of history, and for sure Paul is an historical writer, but what they do is they compare these different books in the Bible, and then they compare them to reliable history from, we know, the historians that were writing at that time, and by looking at them and the things that the gospel writers wrote, you can tell if they're historical or not. This guy, I can't believe him. He mentioned something about this disturbance going on in Rome in 49 AD. For crying out loud, even the New Testament doesn't claim that Jesus was alive and in Rome in 49 AD. Now, I want to get a little bit back to Josephus, because Josephus never wrote about a Jesus. Those two statements are obvious passages, and anybody with any common sense can figure it out for themselves. It's thought that Eusebius, well, at least Eusebius is the number one suspect for this fraudulent interpolation, because before Eusebius' time, none of these Christians pointed to that passage and said, hey, here's proof that Jesus lived. So, and Eusebius did brag about being able to lie for the church, that it was okay to lie for the church. How come that Josephus does not say that there was a Jesus who died under Pilate? How come Josephus, this Orthodox Jew, doesn't write about this madman running into the temple's private property, mind you, swinging his sword and chasing out the traitors? How come Josephus doesn't write about, at the time when Jesus was born, Herod says that all these little babies are supposed to be killed? How come Josephus doesn't write about that?
All right, let's direct those specific questions to Dr. Morey. Dr. Morey.
First of all, let me clarify something. As I stated, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was reported in all the mass media in 1972 that parts of the New Testament had been found and dated. I'm now going to quote from the New York Times. St. Mark, written only a few years after the death of Jesus. Chicago Tribune. If this is accepted, biblical research will be revolutionized. The Los Angeles Times. 9 New Testament fragments dated AD 50 to AD 100 have been discovered in a Dead Sea cave.
So what does that prove? What is your point by these quotations?
Now, number one, you have written descriptions of the life of Jesus written within 10 years of his death, within the generation of those living who, if these Gospels were fabrications, the enemies of Christianity, such as the Jewish writers in the Talmud, etc., could have and would have said Jesus never existed. The enemies of Christianity in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century never said that Jesus didn't live and Jesus did not do what he did. What they said is that either he was an Egyptian magician, as the pagans claimed, or that he was a demon-possessed man, as some Jewish writers claim. The Gospels have to be dated early. Time magazine in 1977 put this out, March 21st, 77, for your sake, Sheila, so you can look it up. This woman is depending upon what she called as common sense. As a theologian, as a historian, I don't depend upon common sense, but upon the documentation and historical research.
All right, with that, we have to break right now for 4 minutes of news. Please, both of you stay with us. We'll be right back here on WTAQ in LaGrange. The time now is 1:30. Our guests on Q-Line this afternoon, Sheila Thompson, who is assistant to the president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and Dr. Bob Morey, who is with us every last Friday of the month. Sheila, at the break there, we were talking about the dating.
I didn't get to answer his thing.
Well, I want to ask you a question based on his comment, and then you can include your answer to whatever you want to include in your answer. But what have you got against using books as a source of history written within 10 years of the death of the subject of the books?
I have nothing against books, but it depends upon when they actually were written. This guy seems to think that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain portions of Mark and Matthew and so forth. For crying out loud, the Dead Sea Scrolls were many, many years B.C. This teacher of righteousness, they seem to think, died probably somewhere 60 B.C. How in the world could Mark, that he already told us, supposedly was bits and pieces of it in 35, 37 A.D., be contained in a book that was written way before that? And besides, it doesn't make any difference where this particular book that he says now was supposed to be written sooner. The fact of the matter is, we do know when Paul wrote, and Paul has a totally different Jesus than the Jesus portrayed in the Gospels. And Paul, in his youth, should have known this character if he lived at that time, and we would know something about him. And
Doesn't Paul, however, quote the other Gospels?
Paul is hung up. There are only 8 books that, for sure, 7 books that Paul actually wrote. There are many that are attributed to Paul that he never wrote. The 4 absolute ones are 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans. There are some other ones he possibly wrote, but there are things attributed to him that he never wrote. But the thing is, you have a different Jesus, and not only do you have a different Jesus between Paul's Jesus and the Gospels, you have all kinds of different Jesus in the Gospels, and this is what makes the Gospels so terribly contradictory.
Now, what do you mean, different kinds of
I'll tell you why. I can't stand these ministers today. You get on a show and you say, okay, Jesus said, according to the Bible, this character said, I came not to bring peace but a sword, and he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one, and bring my enemies before me and slay them. And then they'll turn around and say, oh no, Jesus didn't, Jesus said, and they that take the sword shall perish with the sword, and blessed are the peacemakers. You see, you have a Jesus who's a hawk and a Jesus who's a dove. Now, either you have these total contradictions, and the reason you have these contradictions is because the characters who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and nobody knows who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew did not write Matthew. Luke did not write Luke. Mark did not write Mark. These were titles that were assigned to the Gospels sometime during the 2nd century. Now, when these evangelists put these words into the mouth of their Jesus, that through tradition they believed that he said, this is the reason you come up with all these contradictions in the Bible.
All right, now we've got a lot of points here, contradictions in the Bible, different Jesuses, and so on and so forth. But let's start back at your first comment and ask Dr. Morey. Sheila says that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written before any of the people who wrote the Gospels, so how could they refer to anything in the Gospels?
Again, she shows her ignorance of the field of Dead Sea Scroll research. I've been to Israel and examined the Isaiah scroll. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot of material from the 1st century as well as BC, or before the birth of Christ. As I have stated, particularly in the book, The First New Testament by Dr. Estrada and Dr. White, modern theologians and those involved in textual criticism and archaeology, without hesitation, have agreed now that we find portions of the New Testament in one of the caves in the Dead Sea area. That is the fact. They're sitting there. We have the quotes from the Talmud.
All right, let's stick with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I guess we can't... Sheila is going to argue that they were written before Christ, and you're going to argue that they contain information after the death of Christ.
Well, sure, they contain information about the Atheist community. They contain information about some of the revolts that went on in the first century.
All right, I don't suppose we can resolve this any further, so let's go on to something else. The different Jesuses of the Gospels. How would you respond when she says that Paul's Jesus is different than any of the other Jesuses of the other Gospel writers?
Well, I would say that, again, because she's a lay person who's never studied the original languages, she probably doesn't have a degree in history or philology or philosophy.
Big deal.
She spent 8 months doing a curiosity look at this. She's only read people that would give her what she wants to hear. She simply is taking verses out of context. And this is the old game that the rationalists have always played. Don't confuse me with the archaeological facts. Let me spin my theories in freedom. I would just like to challenge Sheila to read concerning the documentation, the primary sources. Don't depend upon modern rationalist thinkers who've already made up their mind that they don't want to believe in Jesus Christ, and to face the evidence that is there. It's in the Talmud, it's in the early church fathers, it's in the Roman historians and letters, it's there archaeologically in the Nazareth stone, in the grave inscriptions of the first century, what they call the ossuaries. They're the Christian ossuaries in the first century. The evidence is there.
All right, now, I want a couple more things that Sheila said, and then we can go on. What's this business about the different Jesuses of the Gospels, of the Gospel writers? Is that...
Fabrication of her own mind, taking verses out of context.
All right, let's take this hawk-dove contradiction, or apparent contradiction that she brought up about the plowshares.
When Jesus said, I have come to bring not peace but a sword, if you look at the context, he's talking about divisions within a family. Let's say I just talked with Madeline Murray O'Hare's son. Now, he has become a Christian. His mother, being an atheist, has severed all relationship with her son. Well, this is exactly the context Jesus was talking about, how that people would sever their relationship with you because of your allegiance to God. And that is in the context there in Matthew 10. So Christ was not saying, I have come to bring a literal sword to go cut people's heads off. He was talking in the context of the fact that relationship to him would mean that some people who weren't able to accept that would seek to stop you from your freedom of religion.
That's correct, but that's correct, I know that. Jeez. But at the same time, what you gotta understand is you have this Jesus who's coming to divide up families. So much for your Christian family life. Great guy that he was.
Well, that wasn't a Christian family he's dividing. His Madeline Murray O'Hare has rejected her son and will not even answer his letter. Now, whose fault is that there? That is not Christ's problem. That's Madeline's problem.
It happens to be neither a Christ or a Madeline's problem because there is no one by the name of Christ. Christ is not a name. Christ is a title that means anointed one. There were other Christs throughout history. There were other Messiahs throughout history. All it means is anointed. And if you want to read the Bible literally, the Jesus of the Gospels wasn't even anointed. As far as...
All right, now this is a good point. You let him... Dr. Morey, let's go back and forth here with brief comments, and then we can get responses from both of you. Dr. Morey.
To what point?
She said that Jesus was not anointed.
He knows he wasn't. Elijah was supposed to come back from the dead and anoint the Messiah. Elijah never made it.
Well, number one, you don't even know what the word Christos... Yes, the derivation of the etymology of the word had to do with anointing.
Of course
By
it did.
the time the New Testament was written and Christ came on the scene, it meant Messiah. He was anointed of God by the Holy Spirit. This is the whole theme in Matthew 3. He had the Holy Spirit, says Matthew, says John. He was the anointed one of God, the Christ.
That's what the Christians made up, but the prophecy of the Old Testament was that he was actually supposed to be literally anointed.
No, you will not find
And
any
so
such
what does your
prophecy.
Jesus of the Gospels do? He goes and tries to make the people think that John the Baptist was Elijah, and of course John the Baptist says he wasn't, but then Christians wrote the Bible, the Christians wrote the Gospel so they could put in John the Baptist's mouth whatever they wanted to put into
There's a
him.
verse in the Old Testament which says that he, the Messiah, would be literally anointed. Give me the reference right here and now.
I'm supposed to remember absolutely every passage in the Bible, word
If
for
you're
word.
going to make a point, you shouldn't make
If you
it out
gave
of
me
your
time
head
to look
when
it
you
up,
have
I
no
could.
documentation.
If you gave me time to look it up, I would, but it'd probably take me a while. There's that book's a big book, for crying out loud. I wouldn't say it if it weren't true.
Well,
Okay, let's go to other things.
All right, let's go to one other thing that's already been mentioned.
If you locate...
No, just a second now. We were talking about Josephus. Let's clear up the other odds and ends here, and then we can go on with new things. But let's try to cover what we've already talked about. Josephus. Dr. Morey, Sheila asked some questions. Why did not this historian include all of these important points that she enumerated in his coverage or his writings, if indeed he was writing about the Jesus that you're talking about?
How come he doesn't write about the slaughter of the innocents and this Jesus running in and swinging his whip in the temples? And how come he doesn't write about all these zombies who allegedly rose from their graves when Jesus allegedly rose? Don't you think if that happened, Josephus would have written about it? He doesn't write about any of these wild tales.
All right, Dr. Morey.
number one, let's clarify some things about Josephus. Number one, every manuscript ever found has in it the statements concerning John the Baptist, the death of James the Apostle, and the life of Jesus, who is called the Christ. Every single manuscript.
What manuscripts are you talking about? Of Josephus?
And with the manuscripts we can pick up and touch going back 1,000 years.
That's not correct.
1,500
Whose manuscripts or what manuscripts?
manuscripts of Josephus's book on the war are quoted by early church fathers, not only Eusebius, but other ones, who it's also quoted by pagan writers who were against Christianity, which means that the Josephus, that it was not an interpolation or stuck in there by somebody. Now, Sheila's argument in logic is called an argument from silence, which is invalid.
It is not invalid.
Josephus was not to write a biography of Jesus. He mentions Jesus.
No, he didn't. That's a fraud.
John the Baptist. He mentions James the Apostle, and he mentions a lot of other people. His purpose is not a biography of Christ. I have one question. I have read through the works of Josephus. I've got one question for Sheila, yes or no. Have you read through the works of Josephus, yes or no?
You know that I haven't. But at the same time, you are believing what you know ain't so. For crying out loud, that's what Mark Twain said. You're believing it on faith. You're taking that leap of faith. If you look at that passage in Josephus, what kind of an Orthodox Jew, and Josephus said that he was, would have said this is the Christ, which is how that is interpreted. And how come this passage is taken out of context? And he never did tell you, Al, why Josephus, he says that it has no meaning whatsoever, that Josephus didn't tell you these other things. Well, Josephus took down every dirty, rotten little thing that Herod ever did. If he took down those other dirty little rotten things Herod ever did, he certainly wouldn't have messed up on the point of all these little babies being killed and all those zombies rising from the dead. Believe me, he wouldn't have messed up on that. And this guy says he doesn't believe in common sense. He just goes on history. Well, that's sure true.
See, you're the one, Sheila. Is it my turn now, Al?
Go ahead.
Sheila, you're the one who has blind faith. I'm the one who has gravestone inscriptions, Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts.
You don't
I'm
have
the
Dead
one who
Sea
has
Scrolls. They
quotes
don't mention
from
Jesus.
pagan and Roman historians, letters. I'm the one who has the facts, Sheila. You're the one who, by faith, just believing in your heart that Jesus didn't exist, you say to me, don't confuse me with the facts. You're the one who is taking a leap of faith into eternal darkness because you do not want to bow the knee to Jesus Christ.
All right, let me ask a question. If we could resolve this one point that Sheila made very positively, and Dr. Morey has made the opposite point quite positively. Sheila says the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Jesus Christ. Dr. Morey, can you provide a document that she would perhaps accept as reasonable documentation that the Dead Sea Scrolls do mention Jesus Christ?
I would suggest that there's several books on this, but one book that is good is called The First New Testament by Doctors Estrada and White, published by Thomas Nelson Incorporated.
Oh,
Okay, now that's a religious publisher.
yes it is. What do you expect?
But the question is, do you have a document from that book that we could, that people in between, Sheila says the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Jesus, you say they do. Is there a document in this book that we could accept that would be a legitimate documentation that both sides could accept that would prove one way or the other?
The book gives about 27 photographs of the manuscripts in question and gives a full discussion of their identity and how they were dated. And this, for example, Dr. White, who's a friend of mine, has his doctorate from Dropsy College. He is one of the most recognized scholars when it comes particularly to Greek and Hebrew. Also, Dr. Edwin Yamuchi of the University of Ohio was one of the teams of scholars asked to work with the Dead Sea Scrolls. He would more than be willing to speak to anyone concerning this. The documentation is there. As I said, it was in Time Magazine, Newsweek.
Oh, that
Los
must
Angeles
make it
Times.
so.
It came like an
Time
explosion.
magazine.
Well, now, we're trying to establish for people listening right now which person here is right. And Sheila, what documentation would you expect?
I would just ask every single person who is listening to go to their local library and dig out every book that they have on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the shelves, and they will find, and by looking in every single one of them, that the Dead Sea Scrolls are about this teacher of righteousness, not about Jesus the Christ. I will not say Jesus Christ, because Christ is not a name. It is a title, like Attila the Hund or John the Baptist. Jesus the Christ is not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, just the teacher of...
All right, Dr. Morey, Sheila says that people can go to the library and they'll find out that the Dead Sea Scrolls don't have anything to say about Jesus. Well, where would you have them go to find the opposite?
They need to make sure that when they pick up that book on the Dead Sea Scrolls, that it was not written before the contents of Cave 7 had been translated. So when you have, starting in 1972, the explosion that reached in the New York Times, as I said, Los Angeles Times, the London Times, the whole scholarly world was electrified because portions of the Gospels, not the Essean material, but portions of Mark, Luke, etc., were discovered in this cave.
All right, now this is documented in Time and the New York Times and so on?
I read to you some of the quotes. I have here, I'll quote again. Los Angeles Times, 9 New Testament fragments dated AD 50 to AD 100 have been discovered in a Dead Sea cave. Now,
Well, Sheila, wouldn't that answer it?
Well, that to any unbiased person, it would answer it. But as I said, those who already have their minds made up do not say reality must correspond to what I think it is, not my.
All right, Sheila, how do you respond to the article in the Los Angeles Times?
I'd like this Dr. Morey to that now that I think of it, I do vaguely remember reading something like that a long time ago. See, that was before I was into this subject, and what he says is correct. I do not have the biased opinion as for sure he does.
Well, then you can't say that the Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Jesus.
Well, the Dead Sea, what's really called the Dead Sea Scrolls really don't mention Jesus. There are probably some writings. See, the Dead Sea Scrolls were these Essenes who were on the very fringes of Judaism, and if there were still some Essenes around 50 A.D. and so forth, which is what he mentioned, these Essenes at that time remember, all they had to do was find the Gospels and copy down the things that the Gospels had. If the Gospels were already there, the Essenes could have believed what the Gospel writers had written and incorporated them into their writings. So it's possible that there were more Essene writings as these people lived further on, but history progresses and people come up with new ideas. So the Essenes of the first century would have a very different philosophy than the Essenes of the of BC. Just like the first Christians were Jews. The first Christians accepted the God of Israel, the Old Testament, the ideas of a Messiah, and then your Christians later on went and blamed the Jews for killing their Jesus. The whole concept changes, so I can see how this could be. Yes?
Dr. Morey, Sheila had a lot of things to say there.
Again, I would say to any listener, they need to go to a bookstore or to a library, and you can pick up some books on the Dead Sea Scrolls, modern ones, for example, by, let's say, Burroughs, Fisher. All of them will simply tell you that the term Dead Sea Scrolls means loosely any of those writings and artifacts found in those caves along the Dead Sea area. I have been there and visited that area to see the caves in question. It doesn't exclusively refer to the Essenes or to BC or AD. It is a loose term referring to the finds in that area.
All right, with that, we're going to have to take a break, if we may, for some messages, and we'll be right back. KQ in LaGrange, our guests this afternoon, Sheila Thompson, who is with the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. She's the assistant to the president of that organization. She's going to be speaking in Chicago tomorrow at the American Rationalist Convention, and she's going to be talking on the very subject that we've been discussing this afternoon. Also with us is Dr. Robert A. Morey, author, professor, and pastor. And we're going to invite you, our listeners, if you don't feel that we're covering a subject within this subject that you think we should be covering, you can give us a call at 354-8900 if you live in the suburbs, 254-7161 if you live in Chicago. Please, not an argument or anything, a question for one or both of our guests. Just a question, no arguments or comments, because it's too difficult for everybody to pick up all of this, and we have too short a time remaining. Dr. Morey, earlier in the program, Sheila asked you why Jesus is called Jesus of Nazareth when there was no Nazareth. I believe basically that was the question.
Said there was no evidence that it existed. It's not mentioned in the Old Testament, it's not mentioned in the Talmud, and it's not mentioned in Jesus' writings as a place. There was another religious cult, as I like to call them, called Nazarenes or Nazarites, and this is why we think that possibly some evangelists thought, Jesus maybe was a Nazarene, and therefore if he's a Nazarene, he evidently came from a place called Nazareth, and that this is how the title got put in there. But Paul never calls Jesus of Nazareth, calls his Jesus of Nazareth. And remember, Paul never accuses the Jews of killing Jesus. If Paul lived close to this time and he was familiar with these gospel writings, like Dr. Morey seems to think he was, why do you think that he wouldn't have accused the Jews if the other gospel
All right,
writings...
we'll get to that. I want to ask you a question before Dr. Morey answers my question that I asked that was your question. Why is Paul would you accept Paul as an authority? Is he a good historical writer? You quote him favorably all the time, or at least you constantly refer to things he says as being reasonable and understandable to your way of thinking. Is he not an historical authority then? Sheila?
Yeah, are you talking to me?
Yeah, to you.
Right. Oh, I quote Paul all the time because Paul is the only historical writer of the New Testament. He's the only one that we know for sure actually wrote what he wrote. Although there are books in the Bible that are attributed to Paul.
Well, then isn't he somebody who could give us historical evidence of the existence of Jesus?
He won't know. He cannot give us historical evidence because he doesn't say when a Jesus lived or when a Jesus died. He does not write a biography of any Jesus. Why? Because his Jesus was based on tradition, not on a real person. And if a Jesus lived, when Paul was a youth and Paul was this great admirer, and Paul admits he became a Christian around 35 A.D., don't you think he'd tell us something about this guy that he loved? And don't you think he would have quoted this Jesus? He never says Jesus said this or Jesus said that. Never.
All right, Dr. Morey, first of all, to Nazareth.
Huh? Yeah.
All right. First response is simply this. Sheila's committing the typical logical error that most rationalists have committed down through the years.
We mustn't be logical.
They used to say, there's no evidence whatsoever for Hittites. There's no evidence that there was any writing in Moses' day. Therefore, we can assume that there was no writing in Moses' day. Well, the march of archaeology has shown that writing went back beyond Abraham, and that there were the Hittites, the Jebusites, and all the rest of the ites. When it comes to the Nazareth question, we do have the Nazareth stone, which must be dated at least AD 50, and you do have other
What is this stone?
references.
Dr. Morey, what is the stone that you've referred to several times?
This was discovered out in Palestine and was translated in the 50s. And any book dealing with the Bible and archaeology, they will mention the Nazareth stone and its find concerning that period of time. But I say, number one, there is evidence, archaeological, for it. Number two, even if there were not at this moment any other evidence then beyond the historical accounts of the Gospels, which are history, Paul is theology, the Gospels are history, that does not logically imply that the place didn't exist. So there's a logical error that Sheila is making at that point.
There is no logical error. A stone, anybody can pick up a stone and call it anything that you want to call it. How come the Old Testament doesn't name a place called Nazareth, Josephus doesn't name a place called Nazareth, and the Talmud doesn't name a place called Nazareth? If
Okay, that's a good question. Dr. Morey.
the city
Number
existed,
one,
they'd talk about it.
Since Sheila has admitted that she's never read Josephus, and I doubt she's ever read the Talmud, as I have, I don't think she's in a position to be so dogmatic.
I've read parts of Josephus and parts of the Talmud, but not the whole thing. You asked me if I read the whole thing, and I didn't. I read parts of it.
Well, he's saying then that you can't be so dogmatic as to what is included in...
It's just that the things that I'm telling you today are the findings from Protestant theologians, not from these so-called German rationalists, this guy. I'd like to have him call up tonight. Get on the phone and call up Rudolf Bultmann and see what he has to say. He's probably the most famous biblical scholar in the world.
All right, what about him, Dr. Morey?
Bultmann is one of the typical German rationalist theologians whose methodology is no longer accepted in most seminaries today. He's passé because he made up his mind ahead of time what he was going to find in the Gospels and then searched desperately for it. You have Karl Barth, you have Brunner, you have Bultmann, Dillenberg. I can list all the names. I've read, I'm sure, much more than Sheila has read. But these are people who are anti-Christianity.
That's a subjective evaluation. You are making a subjective evaluation.
All right, Dr. Morey, you made a point that she hadn't read the entire writings of Josephus and she had not read the Talmud. So what point are you trying to make by that? Are you saying, what are you saying?
What I said was, logically, that you have a reference to a town, I'll take Lystra, in the book of Acts. Originally, for many years, there was no evidence, archaeologically speaking, that there was such a town as Lystra or Derby, till Sir William Ramsay of Oxford University went over there, who was an agnostic. He did not believe in Christ or the Scriptures. He dug around to disprove the Bible, and when he did, he discovered that Lystra did exist, and he found the coins and the monuments and all of that stuff, which means just because you do not have, at this time, some collaborating evidence as to the existence of this or that town in Scripture, that logically can mean nothing more than at this time you do not have any collaborating evidence.
All right, a good point, and I don't think that could be argued. But what she said was that Nazareth is not mentioned in the writings of Josephus or in the Talmud, and you responded that she hadn't read all the writings of Josephus or the Talmud. Are you suggesting that Nazareth is mentioned in the writings of Josephus and the Talmud, or both?
Well, my question was, Sheila is speaking very dogmatically. As I said, she's a lay person. She has no credentials or degrees in this area.
I don't believe in fairy
She's dabbling in this area, and when she says Josephus never mentions Nazareth, I have to take it with a grain of salt.
Well, you asked
Till I look it up and see for myself.
Okay, tonight you call Wolfhart Tannenberg and H. Chadwick and Arthur Drews and E. Norden and Nathaniel Lardner and Lindemann and Evans and Werner and Councilman and Enslin and Archibald Robertson, and all of these other people. You call them, or some of them are dead. You read what they have written, and then I am going on the basis of what many theologians who've spent their lifetimes have found out. It's not what I think or what I believe. I'm giving you information that they have...
All right, let me ask Sheila a question. Is it possible that Dr. Morey could give you the name of a prominent theologian that might take a differing point of view? What if he took a differing point of view and he was just as prominent as the ones you've mentioned? Would that in any way change your outlook, or what?
Me?
Yeah.
I would have to read what he had to say and compare it. You see, what I did was, I didn't take these guys, as far as when it came to the Bible, things that when they said, Paul didn't say this, or Paul didn't say that, I didn't take their word for it. I went to the Bible, and I went through that horrible, all those things that this terrible man, or this terrible woman hater, Paul, had said. I read all of his writings to find out, did Paul say there was a Mary and a Joseph? Did Paul say that Jesus died under Pilate, that he died in Jerusalem? I didn't take anybody's word for it. I checked it out for myself, and it wasn't there.
What is the significance of the lack of this information in Paul, Dr. Moore? I think you've sort of touched on it, but what...
And see, this is another example of a violation of the laws of logic. When you argue from silence, all you can obtain from that is silence. That Paul would not mention that Jesus was potty trained cannot logically infer that he never experienced potty training. That Paul did not feel any need to refer to Pilate because the Gospels already existed. He quotes the words of Jesus in 1 Timothy 5. He quotes the Gospel of Luke. He refers to the words of Christ in 1 Timothy 6.
Paul did not write the Timothys. He did not write the two Timothys. He did not write that.
Well, so you can state that, but it says the first line that he wrote it.
Of course it says that, because whoever wanted to attribute it to him did it. Of course it says that. You mean you believe the Bible literally?
All right, she seems to have some difficulty understanding how anybody could believe the Bible literally, so I guess at that point we have a problem continuing on this subject. We're going to take a break right now for some messages and be right back. 15 and a half minutes past 2 o'clock. I just want to pick up a couple of loose ends, and I do want to get to the telephones because we got people trying to get through here, but a couple of loose ends. Number one, Sheila said that Mark didn't write Mark, Matthew didn't write Matthew, and Paul didn't write all of Paul. Dr. Morey, 35 seconds.
That's her opinion, but seeing she has no primary source and all they have is guesswork, I can ignore that. The evidence is thoroughly on the other side, as argued by James Thompson of Oxford University, redating the New Testament. Mark wrote Mark. John wrote John. It's a fascinating book by someone who did believe what Sheila believed, and now, because of the evidence, has switched over toward what I believe.
All right, now Sheila says that she is not biased. You apparently believe she is. Do you have a question for her or a comment or what?
Well, you stated that she was an atheist, and she had joined an organization which is running around the country to do what she's doing on the telephone to attack the Bible, Christianity, etc. Obviously, that's a prejudiced person who has an axe to grind.
I would rather run around the country and talk about the truth than run around the country and talk about superstition.
We're dealing with a prejudiced woman like Madeline Murray O'Hare.
He says I'm right.
Are you not prejudiced? Dr. Morey?
Yes.
Are you prejudiced?
Oh,
or biased?
Prejudiced.
Pardon?
Approach the subject as a theist. She's approaching as an atheist. I want to make it go to the facts. She only wants to keep it to theory, not fact.
Oh, you're in trouble then, because the Bible says whatever is not faith is sin. You're in an awful lot of trouble if you're going to look for the facts. You're supposed to be basing everything on faith. Don't you know that as a theologian?
Dr. Morey, do you know that?
I'm
all right, you asked him a question. Do you know that, Dr. Morey? You're supposed to base everything on faith.
I do not think that the New Testament teaches that, because the Gospels were written...
He's correct, Paul. That's something that Paul said. The New Testament...
All right, let's let Dr. Morey answer. Go on.
Again, she is reading one school of theologians, such as Bultmann, who have a leap of faith. It's an existentialism thing. That is not historic Christianity.
I didn't get that from Boltman. I got that straight out of the Bible. Now tell me why if Paul was familiar with these Gospels, then this so-called Lord's Prayer that has a God that's in control that says, oh, please don't lead us into temptation, God. Please don't lead us into temptation. Okay, when people say this Lord's Prayer and the Gospels tell you how to pray, how come Paul says we don't know how to pray? If Paul was...
All right, you asked a question.
You know how to pray.
All right, Dr. Morey?
Number one, she's taken several verses out of context. She's arguing from silence. When Paul said in Romans 8, when we do not know what to say in our prayers, the Holy Spirit will help us, refers to times when you're confused and don't know exactly what to say. The Lord's Prayer was not a liturgical prayer in the early part of the Christian church. That's a modern phenomenon that I do not need to defend. My church doesn't repeat it because it was not intended to be a liturgical prayer. So she's taken verses out of context, mixed them together, rolled them together, and come out with confusion.
All right, let's see if we can't get some listeners involved here. Good afternoon. You're on the air. You're going to have to speak up and ask a question. No comments or speeches.
All right. Well, the thought was brought up that Nazareth doesn't exist and it wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament. I'd just like to say I looked that up. Nazareth exists today, and the reason it wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament is that at the time of Christ, it was only about 600 years old. And if you know your Bible, you'll know that between Matthew and Malachi, there's a 400-year span. So Nazareth would not have existed into the writings of the prophets and the earlier writings in the Talmud and in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So Nazareth existed at the time of Christ. It was about 600 years old, and it exists today. You can go see it today. So that's not a valid thing to say.
It didn't exist until the 4th century when people started going there and as part of the Holy Land stuff.
It existed 600 years prior to Christ. Archaeology has proven that, ma'am.
No.
And one other thing, if you want to debate someone who knows something, then kindly be at least polite to the person. Dr. Morey has done his homework. He doesn't do to you like you do to him. You're typical of most of these atheistic women livers who like to castigate Paul because you say he hated women. Instead of saying something that you know from knowledge, you attack your opponent. You're very rude.
I said that Paul hated women, and anyone who says it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and anyone who says the man is the head of the woman and blames all of the sins of the world onto the head of this woman who has eaten this piece of fruit from a tree is certainly not a man that I can respect.
We don't say that, ma'am. The Bible says what it says, and you're saying things that it doesn't
I'm saying
say.
what Paul said. Paul is an historical writer, and this is something that Paul said. This is one of the books that we do know that Paul wrote, right out of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul was a woman hater. He was also someone who hated the pleasures of life. He was also someone who knew absolutely nothing about a Jesus of Nazareth.
Sir, we thank you for your call this afternoon. Dr. Morey, do you look upon Paul as a woman hater?
No, again, she's taking verses out of context, mixing them up, and this is the problem. If I had the time, Sheila, if you ever get to Central Pennsylvania, you are invited to my home. I've got over 10,000 volumes in my library. I'd love to sit down with you because you haven't heard Orthodox, historic theologians who...
Okay, I want to ask you a direct question, and let's see if you can be honest enough to answer me directly on the radio. I want to know, do you believe that Jesus was divine, or do you believe that there was a Jesus who was just a preacher, a flesh and blood preacher? I want to know precisely what you believe.
I believe that Jesus Christ was God as well as man, that he was the incarnation of deity in human form.
What proof? Okay, great. Thanks for being honest. Now tell me what proof you have for that.
The Old Testament, which predicted that the Messiah would be a God-man, and the New Testament, which states that's exactly who Jesus was. He's God, has the attributes of God, etc.
Then, if this was a fact, sir, the Jews would accept Jesus as the Messiah, and they do not accept him.
Some Jews do. I go to the Messianic Congress. Over 2,000 Jewish Christians meet here 25 miles from my home every July.
That's correct. There are some that do, but many of them don't. And they don't because it is not a fact. There were many Christs. There were many Messiahs. This was an idea that was throughout history. There was Mithra. There was Krishna. There was Hercules. There was Quetzalcoatl. There were all of these savior myths that were similar things with virgins being impregnated by gods who, can you imagine, of course, all these saviors ended up to be male, with the mother's name many times being Mary or...
Okay, we're getting off into some subjects that would be fun to talk about at another time, but unfortunately we don't really have a chance to get into all of those things this afternoon. Let's give each of you perhaps 30 seconds, if we might, to sum up your positions. Sheila, you're the one who says there is no historical evidence of the existence of Jesus, so we'll let you go first.
No, there is absolutely no historical evidence for Jesus. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of current biblical scholars, Protestant biblical scholars. They do not believe that there was a Jesus of Nazareth who said and did all those wild things that you find him saying and doing, like cursing, putting demons into pigs and they run into the seas, and cursing fig trees and telling people they should eat his flesh.
Okay, you say no. Dr. Morey, 35 seconds.
Yes, I would say there are many good Protestant theologians, C.S. Lewis of Oxford, John Montgomery of Greenleaf Law School, F.F. Bruce, University of Manchester, etc. There is more historical evidence for Jesus Christ than for any other historical person. There is literary works from his friends and foes. There's archaeological evidence, letters, correspondence, historians. Only the most biased atheists could possibly close their eyes.
All right.
Dozens of historical evidence.
We have to stop right now. I want to thank both of you for joining us this afternoon.